can you give us a quick overview of the study that you guys did and what's it show for the future?
So we were retained by a group of 13 utilities in the region to look at the question of how do we maintain reliability, how do we keep the lights on as we make this transition from today's sources of energy, which are largely hydro and coal and gas, to a future where we're much more reliant on wind and solar and other clean, non-carbon emitting sources of electricity.
Okay, and was this a recently completed study?
Yeah, it was completed in February of this year.
Okay. What'd you guys find?
So, good news and bad news. The good news is that we found it's possible to achieve very high levels of renewable penetration, very deep levels of carbon reductions for the power system in this region at a pretty reasonable cost. So that's the good news. The policies that the states are setting out to achieve are actually achievable, and they're not that costly. Now, what we did find is that, and this is the bad news, that we're actually in a position where we're not quite sure if we can keep the lights on even today, much less as we start to transition away from these firm coal resources and towards wind and solar, which are more variable in nature.
Well, that's kind of alarming. Wow. Okay. Can you go into that more? Because people like my wife who wants to turn on the bathroom light, we're going to care a lot about that.
So part of it comes down to the way that the utilities govern and plan the regional grid.
Okay.
So there's a grid that spans the entire American West, as well as the provinces of Canada, of Alberta and BC, where electrons just flow from one corner to the other instantaneously. But that grid is governed by 38 separate entities. So they each have control over their little corner of it. And so they can each look at the conditions that are happening in their corner, what electricity demand is doing, what resources are available, but none of them have the picture of what's going on with all of their neighbors. And so for years they've made assumptions that they can rely on their neighbors to help them out in times of need. And we've had a surplus of generating resources in the region for 15 years or so, and so that's been a good assumption. But as we start to look at taking resources off the grid, we now start to get into a situation where maybe their neighbors can't help them in a way that they have been able to in the past. And we're just now, I think, grappling with the nature and extent of that challenge.
So there could be a time in the near future where we look at brownouts or blackouts?
There's always some risk of that. Those things typically happen when you have a long series of unexpected events. There's very cold weather. There are outages of key generators or transmission lines where they go out of service unexpectedly. So there's always a sequence of events that might bring about a power shortage that would require a brownout, what they call rotating blackouts. But the way the system is planned is to make those as rare as possible. So it's really a matter of probability. We're moving into an era where it's perhaps more likely than it has been in the past. Still very unlikely, but maybe more likely than the utilities are used to dealing with as they do forward-looking planning.
And I think we were talking with Steve Wright, and he said that even looking out, I think it was to 2025, suddenly there's a 30% chance of something like that happening. Is that right?
You have to understand what the 30% means, but this is the work that the Northwest Power and Conservation Council staff has been doing in this region for 20 years.
That's separate from you guys.
It's not the work that number is not from our study.
Okay.
But we would probably show quite similar numbers actually. But so what that means is that 1 out of every 3 years in 2025, we might expect to see a shortage of power at some point during the year. And that would depend on how cold the weather is. It would depend on the hydro conditions. So if it's a very wet year, we wouldn't have any problem at all. If it's a very dry year and you get a cold snap, then that's when you might have a challenge.
Okay. And it seems like with what I've heard from some of the discussion in there earlier is all of a sudden with climate change, the weather's not as predictable as it's been in the past.
No, that's a real concern because the way that we do this type of planning actually is looking at past weather conditions and trying to understand how frequently these cold weather events or very hot weather events come about. And the whole standard is based on frequency of those things. So if the weather is changing in an unexpected way, then you're not really sure if the data that you have is any good for the future conditions that you expect to see. So it's quite a challenge that I think the industry is just beginning to grapple with.
And when you guys were doing your study, partly we're trying to educate the public about what's going on, but does taking a plant like Boardman and Chehalis and a couple in Montana, taking those off the grid, is that a big impact?
No, it's a very big impact. So just to give you an example, back to that 33% number, so that was based on, so in 2025, the loss of load probability was in the 7 to 8% range. Then the council staff assumed an early retirement of the Jim Bridger 1 and 2 coal units in Wyoming. So again, large coal units. And just that additional retirement pushed that number from 7% to 33%.
Wow. And that's just those two?
That's just those two, that's right.
Because there's going to be more.
Yeah, and there's several of those that will have retired by 2025, and then we certainly expect more and more to retire after that. There's 11,000 megawatts of coal in our region. There are 3,000 megawatts of those are already planned to retire, and we expect most of the rest to be gone by, let's say, 2035.
Wow, okay. And 11,000 megawatts, any idea how many homes that?
Well, let's see. That would be, let's say, a fourth of the generating capacity for the Northwest region.
11,000 megawatts is a fourth of the generating capacity. Wow, for the
Roughly.
whole Northwest.
Of the whole Northwest, roughly.
That's a lot. And is there any way that renewables can replace that?
So renewables are very, very good at replacing some of the services that those thermal generators provide. So renewables can provide lots and lots of energy, and it's very low-cost energy, as we've seen the prices of wind and solar power decline over time. So during some times of the year, you'll have lots and lots of energy, but during other times of the year, you might not, and that's because obviously the sun doesn't shine all the time, and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So the challenge is, how do you replace the megawatts that the coal units were producing during the times when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing?
Yeah. And how do you?
Well, you need some additional capability. So the challenge isn't that you're building the wind and solar. The challenge is that you need additional resources with the wind and solar to make sure that you can maintain a reliable system during all hours of the year.
There's, and maybe let's just tease this out a little bit more. It seems like some advocates say that if you just build a lot more solar and a lot more wind and get some good batteries, you could be okay.
And certainly elements of that could be part of the solution. What we've seen, the price of lithium-ion batteries at electric grid scale has also come down a lot over the last several years, and that's now a real resource that's a potential to help solve some of these challenges. And there's a number of contracts that have been signed very recently for large numbers of lithium-ion batteries. So those can help solve the problem, but they can't solve it all by themselves, because the issue with the lithium-ion batteries is that the commercial batteries today are, let's say, a 4 to 6 hour duration, which can help you for a one-day event. But the challenge in this region is that our highest electricity demand conditions tend to occur in the wintertime when there's a multi-day cold snap. So the wintertime means there's not much solar energy available, and if the problem lasts for 3 or 4 days in a row, then your 4 to 6 hour batteries are only so effective.
Gotcha. Wow, okay. And so it does, I know you're not the guy who's going to solve the problem, although, I mean, maybe you could, but what fascinates me as a reporter sort of standing back and looking at it is you've got the coal plants going down, you've got local governments restricting natural gas plants, and electricity needs going up all at the same time, and how do you make that gap?
It's a real challenge that I think utilities are facing all over the country, and especially utilities in the most forward-looking jurisdictions with the most forward-looking executives and boards are grappling with this exact challenge, and they don't have a good answer today, other than we need to continue to build natural gas-fired power plants. to make sure that we can keep the lights on during those multi-day periods of low wind and solar production and high demands.
Yeah. Okay. Did you guys look at if you built windmills all over the entire state, would it be enough?
So in theory, you could build enough windmills and solar plants and enough batteries to serve load every hour of the year. But you would have to oversize the system by so much that it becomes impractical. So we think it's really not possible with wind, solar, and batteries to serve load reliably throughout the year. You need some additional type of technology, which we call firm. It's a type of resource that you can turn on when you need it, and it can provide energy at a certain duration, as many days in a row as you need, which wind and solar, even supplemented with the lithium-ion batteries, can't really do.
And we've heard from some folks that, well, you could just bring the power in from California or bring the power in from Montana. Is that enough to solve the problem?
So that would also help. California is also looking to the Northwest to bring power in from this region to help them with some of their peaking challenges that they're facing. Now, our peaks are in the winter up here, theirs are in the summer down there, so there's some diversity there where the regions can help each other out up to an extent. But there's a limited amount that I think it's prudent to rely on your neighbors for. It's one thing to bring power up from California in an emergency. It's another thing to plan to bring power up from California without any long-term contractual arrangements with the generators there, transmission reservations to bring the power up to this region as part of your normal resource planning.
Yeah, okay. And am I right in thinking, part of the reason everybody's here is while there is some danger today, the real danger is a little farther out as these plants retire, and it just takes a long time to turn this ship, basically?
No, I think that's exactly right. Building new resources is at least a 5-year process, and probably longer than that today. There are not very many, if maybe only a handful of new natural gas-fired power plants that are in even the planning stage today, much less permitting and having gone through and got all their permits. So I think people are feeling some urgency looking 5 years out and seeing numbers like a 33% probability of lost load.
Yeah, okay. You get the sense the public has any idea what's happening?
I think the public wants to see the energy system transition from one that relies on fossil fuels and emits carbon to one that relies a lot more on renewables, is a lot cleaner. Yeah. And I think they have a right to have that. I think the industry can achieve it, but I think there are things that the industry needs to do to make sure that electric service is reliable during that transition. The public doesn't have any idea what those things are, and probably hopefully don't need to, because they're deep technical issues.
Yeah, okay. The public doesn't realize there's a danger as the transition's being made if it's not done right.
No, I think that's right. I think there's some education that needs to happen to say, yes, we can get a long way with wind and solar. We can achieve a lot of our environmental objectives by building more wind and more solar and some batteries as well. But there are some limits to that, and here's what those might look like. And here are some of the other resources we might need to achieve the other objectives that you might have, which are to make sure that the lights come on when you flip the switch.
Yeah, okay. Did you guys study, do you have any idea what, the future with zero carbon, what does that cost the typical homeowner, or?
Well, I'll put it this way. When we ran scenarios between 80% and 100% carbon reductions across the Northwest region, to get to 80% carbon reductions, we estimate it's maybe a 5 to at most 10% increase in your average electric rates.
Okay.
So if your monthly bill is $100, then that might be a $5 increase in your monthly bill to achieve 80% carbon reductions. Now that's very, very exciting. And I've been doing these studies for a number of years, and they've always come in higher than that. The reason why it's so low now is just because of what's happened with the cost of wind and solar and some of these new technologies. So that's really exciting. To go beyond that, to get all the way to zero carbon with today's technologies, we estimate that would double your electric rates. So this is the scenario where you're massively overbuilding the wind and solar resources, and there's windmills on every mountain and solar panels on every corner, because that's really what it would take with today's technologies. Now, we certainly hope and expect that new technologies will come along that can help us fill this gap in a way that doesn't emit carbon. But until they do, we need to keep the resources, some of the resources around that we rely on today for that service.